those of you who may have some questions. I don't know whether we have we need a microphone. Would anyone like to? Yes, have questions to our presenters?
Yes, Mark, at one point you mentioned on the way that you thought there were dangers to putting history too firmly as the basis of the national identity as understood. Could you spell out what you think those dangers are?
Yeah, sure. Did everyone hear the question?
No.
Okay, so the question was, well, you say it again, John. Yeah.
All right. That Mark mentioned in passing that he thought there were dangers putting too much weight on history in terms of constructing a national identity. And I'm just asking Mark if he can spell out what some of those dangers are.
Thanks for the question. I guess the first danger that I would see is that the past can be taken too literally, and it can, in using it for a political purpose, the understanding of it can be narrowed. So that would be one danger. I think also around Australia at the moment, there are many examples of local communities building memorials to events that took place on the frontier, massacre sites, or where particular clashes occurred. And the descendants of Aboriginal people, their families, and also the settlers' descendants come together around those memorials. And I think on a community level, that's a tremendously positive thing, because you can see how communities are actually ahead of the government. The government, it's not only the issue of acknowledging history, you can pick many other issues as well, where our national parliament seems paralysed, so divided, and of course we're not alone in liberal democracies around the world on that issue, but I think that history is very central. The fundamental thing about history in Australia is that the way in which the land was taken, without treaty, without compensation, without consent, has not been acknowledged sufficiently. That is the fundamental issue. But in doing that, I guess I'm saying, I'm saying don't load too much expectation onto the stories from the past to solve the politics now. Acknowledge it, but remember it's a different place. It's a foreign country as well as everything else. Long answer, sorry.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Yes.
Hi. A couple of, well, I was going to say I'll apologise in front because it might sound more like a comment than a question. But thank you very much, Richard, for the notion of music as an end in itself that doesn't have to mean anything else. That was lovely to hear. Mark, you made a comment, I thought, about the fact that the Turnbull government's rejection of the Uluru Statement was a failure of Australia. And I just wanted to draw a distinction because I suspect that the Turnbull's comment about the statement bore as much relation to Australia's view as did Tony Abbott's comments about same-sex marriage.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and be more specific. I guess the failure, it was Turnbull's failure, sure. As Prime Minister, he has a particular responsibility in terms of his role in speaking for the nation at times. He dismissed that Uluru Statement with the issuing of a press release. There was no prime ministerial address to the nation. It was just an email press release. That was how it was dismissed. So it did not pay this incredibly unique document the respect that it deserved. Even if you disagree with it, you should give it the respect. Yeah. So that was the great failing, which I think pointed to the fact that we're just not accustomed to negotiating with Indigenous people as equals. I mean, I know there's a lot of examples at the moment around the country where treaty work is being done in Victoria, also in South Australia and other places. But historically, we don't have that culture of negotiation. And that's one thing we have to build. I just should say quickly that at the moment, I don't know if people realise that in the budget last week, the government actually, I think, has put $7 million or thereabouts into another process of negotiation with Indigenous communities to see what options might be there for the voice. Now that is, to my mind, nothing but a classic stalling mechanism. Avoid any division about it during the campaign and just put it to yet another process of negotiation, and it'll stall it again. So it's really come, we have to sort it out. We have to do something, and I think we need somehow to build that consensus to make something happen. We've been talking about it for a long time, but thanks for the comment.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, would you like to? Bradley? Oh, sorry, yes?
Yeah,
Sorry, I didn't see you behind. Oh, okay.
yep. Thanks very much, Mark, and Andrew as well. The Turnbull arrogant dismissal of that Uluru statement, I think that was one of his worst actions. You compare that with Paul Keating in the Redfern speech, right? Now, what do you think was driving it? Was the right wing? Because he was a Republican, he was the man that pushed for the Republic, and that fell away, of course. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks. Please, Patricia and Andrew, if you want to say something on this as well, chime in, because I don't want to monopolise all the time. Okay. What drove Turnbull's response? You know, first and foremost, a failure to see what was being asked of him. Yeah, a failure to understand what was actually being asked of him. Also, sheer politics. He had a one-seat majority. He had the right wing. It's another example. He's got the right wing of his own party saying, if you touch that, if you even touch it, you're gone. You're finished. So politically, it was better to push it away, he thought at the time. Paul Keating's Redfern Park speech was the first time an Australian Prime Minister had ever acknowledged the things we took the children away, we brought the diseases, we did the killing. It was the first admission by an Australian Prime Minister of that history. And in a way, when John Howard came to power in 2007, he stated at a Supreme Court function, or High Court function, I'm not sure, can't remember, Australia was settled without conflict, without war. So we've had these two partisan, very different perspectives on our past that we've not yet worked through, we've not yet reconciled. And that's part of the challenge of working this Uluru Statement out and working the truth-telling out as well, because they address that issue. And they're fundamental to the sort of country we want to become. So that would be my answer.
This is a question to Andrew. Thanks very much for the talk. I went to WOMAD for the first time just a few weeks ago, and I was struck that not only were the musicians excellent musicians, but when they talked the language of reconciliation, of peace, of human working together and so on. To what extent do you think that can be mobilised to spread peace in the world? And it seems to me that in Australia in particular, the broadcast media, including the ABC, don't play enough of world music or don't give enough of these voices a chance to be heard.
Well, goodness, there's several questions there, really, including at least two that you didn't ask. Yes. Well, first of all, I think, I mean, I don't think it's surprising that musicians tend to be in favour of reconciliation and peace and so on. I mean, occasionally, because, you know, at the ABC we're terribly concerned about balance, we think, you know, oh, there must be a right-wing folk singer out there somewhere. But frankly, it's a little more elusive than the right-wing Philip Adams. And I think it's actually very difficult. Musicians tend to be the sorts of people who want to make the world a better place. And that's what perhaps some of us actually think we're doing, however, you know, quixotic that might be. But that's sort of what drives musicians. And musicians want to communicate. They want people to hear their music. So therefore, they have to like other people, or they wouldn't be making music in the first place. So there's all of that. There is, I mean, I've been to Womadelaide Adelaide a lot. I actually am not quite sure now how many years we've been broadcasting from there, but I'm not totally uncritical of it, I have to say. There is a sort of suggestion that, because you all know what Womadelaide is. I mean, there's like it's a big outdoor 4-day event in Botanic Park, Adelaide, and there are, I think, at least 7 stages, some big and small, and at this music festival, the performances are about 45-50 minutes. Little less than an hour anyway, and you can go from stage to stage, and there is this sort of sense of kind of cultural tourism and people ticking off, well, that was Iceland, now let's go and do Nigerian music, and well, that's only going to take 50 minutes, and then we can do, and so there's a sort of, I don't know how to say this without sounding insulting to Womadelaide, which I don't want to be, and I don't mean to be. But I'm a little bit suspicious of some of what lies behind, not the presentation of the music, but in the sense the attendance at it and what people think they're getting when they go there. Because I've been there, as I said, for many, many years, and I can't claim to be very knowledgeable about any of the things, even the things that I've really enjoyed at the time. I mean, so it is a bit like sampling. You know those festivals where you go and there's all these different foods, and you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but you still don't really know anything about the culture. So, but it's a start, isn't it? You know, looking on the bright side. And yes, of course, there should be more of it. But one of the thing you didn't ask, which I find quite interesting, I was doing a talk last year at ANU, and somebody said to me, you know, when there was a sitar player on the music show recently, and he said there is this tendency to, with a culture like Hindustani music, in this case, to indulge in, I believe that the term is othering, and that you present the music as though it's something exotic, which obviously, as far as the Hindustani people are concerned, it's not. All right, this is a problem in terms of broadcasting, in terms of presenting this music, and this goes for all of the other musics at Womadelaide, which is how do you present these musics to listeners who don't know about them? Okay, we have had many, many musicians from the north and the south of India on the music show in the last 25 years, and do we, every time we have a musician on, do we have to say, all right, so tell me, what's a raga? Or do we assume that people know? And there is no right answer to that. And just as when you have, you know, a slide guitar player on from America? Do you have to go back to first principles every time and ask the same questions you asked of the last slide guitar player you had on? And you've got to get that balance right, the way you present that music, because there are people listening who know nothing, who've never heard of the concept of slide guitar, and there are people who have got a lot of Raikuda records and much more at home and know perfectly well what it is, and you have to broadcast to them both. And so when it comes to the Hindustani musician and what is a raga, sometimes we ask and sometimes we don't. And sometimes we take it for granted that people know what a sitar is, and sometimes we go back to first principles. But what this person was criticising the music show for was kind of valid. I mean, but I don't know how else to do it on radio except by straying into the area which could be described as making something exotic that isn't necessarily exotic. You know, it's the Edward Said thing. So that was the question you didn't ask.
I wonder if I might interject with a question myself, and this is for perhaps both Mark and Andrew. Mark, you referenced Peter Sculthorpe and Ross Edwards. I'm wondering, of both of you, do you think that there are any issues or problems with non-Indigenous composers trying to get their teeth into Indigenous music or Indigenous cultures? And I might cite as an example Sculthorpe's Jalili, which maybe, Andrew, you can talk to more. Or, in the alternative, do you think there are perhaps opportunities or potentialities for cross-cultural understanding that might be enabled by that sort of cross-cultural music pollination? Cross-pollination.
Okay.
Do you want to go first?
I'll go first because I'll probably be brief, and that is there are many problems. Many problems, I think. And the way I would answer, I don't play music myself, but it's a similar, at the moment you can find Indigenous scholars and spokespersons saying, if you want to understand the history of colonialism in Australia, put historians over here and just listen to Indigenous voices, okay? Put the history over here and just listen to the testimony of individuals. Now, of course, we have to do both, I think. And I can understand why some people would say that. But when it comes to composers using, there are many issues around historians using the testimony of Aboriginal people in their work, using the stories that Aboriginal people tell in their work, many, many complex ethical issues. And so too, I imagine, with composers bowling in, it depends how it's done. It could be genuinely collaborative, for example, in a way in which the ideas of Aboriginal music are not sampled in a kind of smorgasbord approach, but are actually really seriously engaging with non-Indigenous music. And I think Gurumul, Pingu's last album, is a kind of example of this attempt to build a bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous music.
Yes, I agree with all of that. It's a difficult area, of course, and Peter Sculthorpe certainly took various bits of Aboriginal chant. Jalili is the most obvious example because it's a piece that he wrote about a dozen times, maybe more than a dozen. There's a version for 12 cellos, there's a version for orchestra, there's a version for guitar, so he kept coming back to it and redoing it and redoing it and redoing it. He certainly did it. He was certainly extremely well intentioned. There's no doubt about that, and also, in a sense, vindicated by the fact that in the last years of his life, he was a collaborator with William Barton, the didgeridoo player, who came, in a way, appropriated Sculthorpe's music, in as much as there were these pieces which already existed, well-known pieces, orchestral pieces that had been played many times that Sculthorpe had written in the 70s and 80s and 90s, pieces such as Mangrove and Earth Cry and Kakadu. And because Sculthorpe's music was full of what we call pedal points, that's to say, a low note which sort of runs through a whole section of a piece and doesn't change, he discovered, or William discovered, or they discovered together that you could whack a didgeridoo in there and it would sound jolly good. It was as though the music had been waiting for the didgeridoo to come along, and it didn't sound tacked on, although it was tacked on, because, as I said, the piece already existed. But in a sense, it completed the piece. So that was rather wonderful that should happen. But yes, it is a tricky area, and I've only twice attempted to deal with anything in my music that approximates to this. One was a piece, in fact, you were mentioning, Mark, pieces of music about Uluru, and there was a project which ran for a while between the cellist David Pereira and the record label Tall Poppies, where David and Tall Poppies commissioned composers to write pieces in response to Uluru, or inspired by Uluru, or somehow relating to Uluru, or I might say non-Indigenous composers. And I came slightly late to that party, and I wrote a piece called Memorial, seeing the rock as a kind of cenotaph in the middle of Australia, which of course it's not, but that's how it seemed to me. And it's a rather spare and rather violent piece, actually, about a war memorial, but it certainly doesn't include anything consciously Indigenous from the point of view of the music. And the other piece was a piece called The Past, which was a setting of two texts, one of them excerpts from Captain Cook's journal in April, May 1770, from his ship's log on first arriving on off the coast here, and the other text being the poem that Oodgeroo Noonuccal wrote 200 years later on the 200th anniversary, called The Past. And I put the two texts, I sort of cross-cut the two texts, and it's written for a string orchestra and a flute and a countertenor or mezzo-soprano voice, and Oodgeroo's poem, which is a very good poem, which I'll try to remember the beginning of it. Let no one say the past is dead. The past is all around us and within, is how it starts. And I've used that line a few times, as well as the rest of her poem, and brought it back at the end. And I thought, at this point, what I need to happen is for my string orchestra to sort of vaporize and for a didgeridoo to play. And so that's what happens at that point. Now, I don't know anything about didgeridoos. I don't know how, I couldn't compose music for a didgeridoo. I wouldn't know what to do. It was, even before you considered the rights and wrongs of it, I wouldn't have a clue. So in the score at that point, it says, at this point, a didgeridoo may play, or not. And in fact, the piece has been performed both ways, but it works much better with the didgeridoo. and it's up to the didgeridoo player what to do. I do suggest that it would be very, very nice if the didgeridoo were in E, because it would fit with what's just happened. But beyond that, it's up to the player what to do, and also for how long to play. He can play for an hour if he wants to. But it was so that kind of, in a way, overcame the issue that Brad was there you are alluding to of permission. In a sense, I'm giving him permission to come and play in my piece if he wants to. But yes, it is a terribly, terribly fraught area.
Okay, we just have another question from, yes?
Hi. So my question is somehow related to Bradley's question, but I was always thinking about like the conflict between like popular culture and like traditional culture. So for example, like in terms of music, like pop culture, maybe like popular music, like American popular music, it may be like listened by teenagers and youth all over the world, like from all countries. But like on the other hand, like really, really traditional music. So for example, like the music that's played by like traditional instruments and maybe in like different countries. So like Irish traditional music or like Chinese traditional music. So like I think, I don't know, but I want to ask your opinions about like if the popular culture and the like which of these two types of cultures are like more helpful to the like promotion of world peace? Because like popular culture, it may be like enjoyed by more people. However, like the traditional culture, it's more diverse. So like you can actually get to see the culture itself. But like people seldom study them or like seldom listen to or watch them. But like so like now I think maybe a lot of the traditional cultures are gradually disappearing. But like the pop culture, on the other hand, it's also like promoting people to connect to each other worldwide. So like it's kind of a conflict that I was confused about, and maybe I can hear your opinions on it. Thanks.
I think you've put your finger on something there. And you didn't mention classical music, which is another strand which is different again, actually. And I might say something about that first, because I was thinking earlier that in terms of the international language thing, that one of the reasons I think that people say that music is an international language is because when it comes to classical music, which is truly international, I mean, that's to say, I'm talking about Western classical music, but Western classical music is probably healthier in China today than it is in Europe. So it is international, and yes, you can get a bunch of string players, and you can sit them down, and you can put music in front of them, and they will all play the same thing. And that's what the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, in the Baron Boehm and Edward Said formed in the Middle East. That it operates on that principle, that you bring people from different cultures together, and they can all, follow the conductor and make a nice noise. So that is, in a sense, genuinely international, whatever its origins might be. But then the pop music, in a sense, is a lot less international, even though it's heard by many more people, but it's essentially American, albeit with a strong influence from West Africa, but that was a long time ago. It's been remade many times over in America since then. So, and then there's, as you say, traditional musics, which are perhaps the other end of the scale, where you could play one culture's music to another culture, and you might find connections, or you might find incomprehension, depending on what the cultures are, and how much you need to know. Because although we can talk about all music in terms of pitches and rhythms and so on, and we can analyse it and describe it and point to that and say, yes, I know what that interval is. You may not know what any of the cultural significance of what you're listening to is, and you may completely miss it. Just as we, for example, now when we read Shakespeare, we're bound to miss things. There are cultural references that Shakespeare's audience would have got that we can't get, because we're not early 17th century people. So, I mean, but what it comes back to is what I was saying, which is listening, and that's the great strength of music in a diplomatic context, that people have to be quiet and listen, and listening. You know, as Mark was saying, in terms of historians listening to Indigenous people, is something which we all need to get better at. We live in quite a visual world, I think, and a lot of the things that often used to happen orally don't anymore. When I was a child, we used to chant our multiplication tables. And it wasn't a very good way of understanding maths. It was a very good way of remembering what 7 times 8 is. So we used to remember. We used to learn poetry. I still try to do that, actually. But there are things that in our lives and in our educations which were once to do with sound, which are now almost purely visual. And I think as a result, partly of that, we've become less good at listening, and that's another reason that music is important, I think, and particularly music you don't understand.
I'll just say one quick thing, and that is that a lot of traditional music, of course, is rooted in the community itself. It's inseparable from everyday life. It's part of the fabric of the everyday. It's not necessarily taken to a studio and recorded. And that maybe is a way of asking, I wanted to ask Andrew a question about your point that music communicates music. I remember years ago I was in Mali in West Africa, and I was wandering down a lane and suddenly came upon this impromptu concert, which was just extraordinary. The dust was rising from the... It was really visceral, an overused word, but it was. So I guess this is a roundabout way of saying, if I see Andrew Ford perform his music, his composition, or I see Taylor Swift perform, is it the human level that's capable of communicating something? There is the music as notation, as music, but to see it performed, there's an infinite variety of human imprints on that music. Is that where the communication takes place, potentially?
Maybe. It's funny, I'm often mistaken for Taylor Swift. Well, yes, of course. And as somebody, I'm really not a performer. I'm sorry, I am not a performer. I once said to somebody, I can't really play the piano, and my wife said, you know, in that sentence the word really is redundant. So I'm dependent upon other people doing it for me. And one of the most interesting things is when you write a piece and it gets performed quite a bit by different people. And they bring different things to it, of course. And sometimes quite surprisingly different things. So some of the meaning is made there as well as, and most of the meaning is made in the head of the listener. And of course, one of the listeners is the performer or performers. But again, we have to be careful when we use that word meaning, don't we? Because then somebody says, yes, well then what does it mean? And as I said, what it means is musical. But when you talk about music in the community and ritual, for example, music in ritual, whether it's a didgeridoo, a yidaki being played in this country in a community, or whether it's, you know, a ritual for the opening of Parliament or something, with fanfares and whatnot. I mean, there, of course, the music does have a function. Yeah. And at a simpler level, at a more obvious day-to-day level, it has a function when people dance. I mean, music written for people to dance to. So there it plays a kind of function as well. But again, they're usually quite abstract functions. But one of the important things in that kind of music is that you've got to get it right. You've got to, if you're playing music for people to dance to and you don't get it right, they'll fall over. And in a ritual sense, the whole point of ritual is to repeat things in the same way as they were repeated before. And so, strangely enough, on this morning's music show, I was talking to a yidaki player called Gumarai Newman about this very thing, about the fact that improvisation plays very little part in what he does with his didgeridoo in traditional music, because the important thing is to get it right, not to make it up.
Thanks. No, thanks.
We need to, we'll be needing to close out, and this has been a very stimulating discussion we're having here, and I'd like probably for those of you who still would like to continue, we can continue during afternoon tea, but I'd just like to call Jessica Carroll to come up and just say a few words, and perhaps we'll be able to continue the discussion and questions during afternoon tea. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Carroll. I'm the Director of International House and have been here since probably about 17 years now. Not quite as long as Graeme was Director, but I've been here a long time. During that time, I've seen many, many students from very, very different countries come through the door. When you say 193 countries, I think we've probably had over 100 countries through this house. And currently over 40 different countries in the House today. I'd sincerely like to thank 3 wonderful speakers today. I came here today not knowing very much at all about music, very little about history, and also about human rights and peace and conflict studies. So I now know a lot more than I did before I came today, and I'm sure everybody here is the same. I would like to ask you to please thank our 3 speakers for such a wonderful discussion. Please give them a round of applause. I'm not even going to try and summarise what the speakers had conveyed today, but I think for me, 3 things really stood or touched me, and that was really about listening to other people, listening to other histories, just listening to music and different music, and really seeing people as equals, as human beings from very different backgrounds, with different histories, with different cultural, I guess, nuances. Everybody comes from a different place, but we're all equal. And if we can listen to each other, perhaps we have a chance of treating each other as equals. I would like to just do a few thank yous, if I may, before we have afternoon tea. Thank you so much again to our speakers for their time today. I know they're very busy and they've got, I'm delighted that they have had the opportunity to speak to us today in the inaugural de Graaff-Elms Roundtable. The Roundtable is such an appropriate discussion point the Roundtable is very symbolic of International House. We here at International House have roundtables for a very specific purpose. Not only are they round, it enables people to sit together in a very equal position. It enables people to sit and discuss international relations, history, music, or whatever it is that they want to discuss on a daily basis. Around our dinner tables, today we've got 3 wonderful speakers. Around our daily dining tables, we would have anything from 5 to 10 people sit at these tables, sometimes even more. They try to squeeze as many people together on a table. And we would have, again, 5 to 10 different nationalities or countries on those tables discussing very, very specific things like we've discussed today. And that is really symbolic of International House. And I'm really delighted that SUIHAA, after our wonderful 50th anniversary, came up with the concept of a roundtable discussion to honour the founding director of International House, Graeme de Graaff, and his wonderful partner and opera singer and musician, Lauris Elms. So on that note, I'd also like to pay homage to Mr. de Graaff and to Lauris Elms, because without them, we wouldn't have International House. They are not only individual, inspirational people, they are together a formidable partnership and have contributed so much to International House, and I'm delighted that this inaugural roundtable has been initiated and supported and funded by SUIHAA. So thank you to Dr. Ros Madden for getting the roundtable up and running. Yes, absolutely. Thank you to everybody for being here today. We've got a range of people in the room. We've not only got our guest speakers, we've got Mr. de Graaff and Lauris Elms, but we've got alumni here from the very first year in 1967, right through to our current residents who are students here today. And our students are here, and they are our future. They are our future leaders. And so I'm really delighted that most of you could be here today. I know you've got studies to do and assignments and all of that, but thank you so much for being here today. And finally, I would just like to, again, congratulate SUIHAA and thank all of our guest speakers for a wonderful discussion today. And I'd finally like to invite you to stay on and have some afternoon tea with us and to continue the discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you.